Continuing Demosthenes from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. But when things came at last to war, Philip, on the one side, being not able to live in peace, and the Athenians on the other side being stirred up by Demosthenes, the first action he put them upon was the reducing of Euboea, which, by the treachery of the tyrants, was brought under subjection to Philip, and on his proposition the decree was voted, and they crossed over thither and chased the Macedonians out of the island. The next was the relief of the Byzantines and Perinthians, whom the Macedonians at that time were attacking. He persuaded the people to lay aside their enmity against these cities, to forget the offenses committed by them in the Confederate War, and to send them such succors as eventually saved and secured them. Not long after, he undertook an embassy through the states of Greece, which he solicited and so far incensed against Philip that, a few only accepted, he brought them all into a general league, so that, besides the forces composed of the citizens themselves, there was an army consisting of 15,000 foot and 2,000 horse, and the money to pay the strangers was levied and brought in with great cheerfulness. On which occasion it was, says Theophrastus, on the allies requesting that their contributions for the war might be ascertained and stated. Crobulus, the orator, made use of the saying, "War can't be fed at so much a day." Well, in my country they're saying, well, the war can be fed by so much a day, and it's like, well, I don't think everybody in the country needs to be paying dollars a day towards a war. That doesn't makes them less safe, but anyways. Now was all Greece laid up in arms, and in great expectation what would be the event. The Euboeans and the Achaeans, the Corinthians, the Megarians, the Leucadians, the Coraans, their people and their cities were all joined together in a league. But the hardest task was yet behind, left for Demosthenes, to draw the Thebans into this confederacy with the rest. Their country bordered next upon Attica. They had great forces for the war, and at that time they were accounted the best soldiers of all Greece. But it was no easy matter to make them break with Philip, who, by many good offices, had so lately obliged them in the Phocian War, especially considering how the subjects of dispute and variance between the two cities were continually renewed and exasperated by petty quarrels arising out of the proximity of their frontiers. But after Philip, being now grown high and puffed up with his good success at Amphissa, on a sudden surprise Elatea, and possessed himself of Phocis, and the Athenians were in a great consternation. None durst venture to rise up to speak. No one knew what to say. All were at a loss, and the whole assembly in silence and perplexity. In this extremity of affairs, Demosthenes was the only man who appeared, his counsel to them being alliance with the Thebans, and having in other ways encouraged the people, and, as his manner was, raised their spirits with hopes. He, with some others, was sent ambassador to Thebes to oppose him as Marsyas says, Philip also sent thither his envoys, Amantus and Clearchus, 2 Macedonians besides, Daacus, a Thessalian, and Thrasadaus. Now the Thebans, in their consultations, were well enough aware what suited best with their own interests, but every one had before his eyes the terrors of war, and their losses in the Phocian troubles were still recent. But such was the force and power of the orator, fanning up, as Theopompus says, their courage, and firing the emulation, that casting away every thought of prudence, fear, or obligation, in a sort of divine possession, they chose the path of honor to which his words invited them, and this success thus accomplished by an orator was thought to be so glorious and of such consequence that Philip immediately sent heralds to treat and petition for a peace. All Greece was aroused, motivated, and up in arms to help. And the commanders-in-chief, not only of Attica, but of Boeotia, applied themselves to Demosthenes, and observed his directions. He managed all the assemblies of the Thebans, no less than those of the Athenians. He was beloved both by the one and by the other, and exercised the same supreme authority with both, and that not by unfair means or without just cause, as Theopompus professes, but indeed it was no more than was due to his merit. But there was, it would seem, some divinely ordered fortune commissioned in the revolution of things to put a period at this time to the liberty of Greece, which opposed and thwarted all their actions, and by many signs foretold what should happen. Such were the sad predictions uttered by the Pythian priestess, and this old oracle, cited out of the Sibyl's verses, the battle on Thermodon that shall be, safe at a distance I desire to see, far like an eagle, watching in the air, conquered shall weep, and conquer perish there. Of course, a Sibyl is an oracle reader. A Cassandra is someone that claims prophetic authority on everything, and you find that Muhammad and Moses and Zarathustra didn't claim to have religious authority on everything. It was spiritual matters. Sure, they took part in physical matters, but they weren't saying, God told me this is how you plant a tree, or they weren't doing that. But I don't know what mundane example or this. Thermodon, they say, is a little rivulet here in our country, in Calronia, running into the Cephisus, but we know of none that is so called at the present time, and can only conjecture that the streamlet, which is now called Haman, and runs by the temple of Hercules, where the Grecians were encamped, might perhaps in those days be called Thermodon, and after the fight, being filled with blood and dead bodies upon this occasion, as we guess, might change its old name for that which it now bears. Yet Dries says that this Thermodon was no river, but that some of the soldiers, as they were pitching their tents and digging trenches about them, found a small stone statue, which by the inscription appeared to be the figure of Thermodon, carrying a wounded Amazon in his arms, and that there was another oracle current about it, as follows: the battle on Thermodon, that shall be. Fail not, black raven, to attend and see. The flesh of men shall there abound for thee. And so Thermodon was a divinized hero that kept them safe from the Amazons. I don't know. There's not really much of a myth there, but there's stories like that where people, they think, yeah, oh, this is a place, or this is a statue. It's like, no, it's a person. Of course, a statue being based on the person, but but yeah, even the people around may have the wrong perception about identities when mythology is involved. In fine, it is not easy to determine what is the truth, but of Demosthenes it is said that he had such great confidence in the Garcian forces, and was so excited by the sight of the courage and resolution of so many brave men ready to engage the enemy, that he would by no means endure they should give any heed to oracles or hearken to prophecies, but gave out that he suspected even the prophetess herself, as if she had been tampered with, to speak in favor of Philip. The Thebans he put in mind of Epaminondas, the Athenians of Pericles, who always took their own measures and governed their actions by reason, looking upon things of this kind as mere pretexts for cowardice. Thus far, therefore, Demosthenes acquitted himself like a brave man, but in the fight he did nothing honorable, nor was his performance answerable to his speeches, for he fled, deserting his place disgracefully, and throwing away his arms, not ashamed, as Pythias observed, to belie the inscription written on his shield in letters of gold, with good fortune. In the meantime, Philip, in the first moment of victory, was so transported with joy that he grew extravagant, and going out after he had drunk largely to visit the dead bodies, he chanted the first words of the decree that had been passed on the motion of Demosthenes. The motion of Demosthenes, Demosthenes' son, dividing it metrically into feet and marking the beats. But when he came to himself, and had well considered the danger he was lately under, he could not forbear from shuddering at the wonderful ability and power of an orator who had made him hazard his life and empire on the issue of a few brief hours. The fame of it also reached even to the court of Persia, and the king sent letters to his lieutenants, commanding them to supply Demosthenes with money, and to pay every attention to him, as the only man of all the Grecians who was able to give Philip occupation and find employment for his forces near home, in the troubles of Greece. Now, I don't spell it with a K sound, but they always have the E at the end. This, but I'm not sure the verb and all that stuff. The verb, noun. Anyways, this afterwards came to the knowledge of Alexander by certain letters of Demosthenes, which he found at Sardis, and by other papers of the Persian officers, stating the large sums which had been given him. At this time, however, upon the ill success which now happened to the Garcians, those of the contrary faction in the Commonwealth fell foul upon Demosthenes, and took the opportunity to frame several informations and indictments against him. But the people not only acquitted him of these accusations, but continued towards him their former respect, and still invited him as a man that meant well to take part in public affairs, insomuch that when the bones of those who had been slain at Chaeronea were brought home to be solemnly interred, Demosthenes was the man they chose to make the funeral oration. They did not show, under the misfortunes which befell them, a base or ignoble mind, as Theopompus writes in his exaggerated style, but on the contrary, by the honor and respect paid to their counselor, they made it appear that they were no way dissatisfied with their counsels he had given them. The speech, therefore, was spoken by Demosthenes, but the subsequent decrees he would not allow to be passed in his own name, but made use of those of his friends, one after another, looking upon his own as unfortunate and inauspicious, till at length he took courage again after the death of Philip, who did not outlive his victory at Chaeronea, and this, it seems, was that which was foretold in the last verse of the oracle: "Conquered shall weep, and conqueror perish there." Demosthenes had secret intelligence of the death of Philip, and laying hold of the opportunity to prepossess the people with courage and better hopes for the future, he came into the assembly with a cheerful countenance, pretending to have had a dream that presaged some great good fortune for Athens. Yeah, don't lie about your dreams. And not long after arrived the messengers who had brought the news of Philip's death. No sooner had the people received it, but immediately they offered sacrifice to what they considered to be gods and goddesses, and decreed that Pausanias should be presented with a crown. Demosthenes appeared publicly in a rich dress, with the chaplet on his head, though it were but the 7th day since that death of his daughter, and it is said by Aeschines, who upbraids him upon this account, and rails at him as one void of natural affection towards his children. Oh, come on. Several days later, you can leave the home. Whereas, indeed, he rather betrays himself to be of a poor, low spirit and effeminate mind, if he really means to make the wailings and lamentations the only signs of a gentle and affectionate nature, and to condemn those who bear such accidents with more temper and less passion. For my own part, I cannot say that the behavior of the Athenians on this occasion was wise or honorable, to crown themselves with garlands and to sacrifice to what they consider to be gods and goddesses for the death of a prince who, in the midst of his success and victories, when they were a conquered people, had used them with so much clemency and humanity. For, besides provoking fortune, it was a base thing and unworthy in itself. Well, base things can have, spiritual things, spiritual consciousness and ceremony mixed with it, right? I mean, don't be chanting on the toilet, but you know what I mean. To make him a citizen of Athens, and pay him honors where he lived, and yet, as soon as he fell by another's hand, to set no bounds to their jollity, to insult over him dead, and to sing triumphant songs of victory, as if by their own valor they had vanquished him. I must at the same time commend the behavior of Demosthenes, who, leaving tears and lamentations and domestic sorrows to the women, made it his business to attend to the interests of the Commonwealth, and I think it the duty of him who would be accounted to have a soul truly valiant and fit for government, that standing always firm to the common good, and letting private griefs and troubles find their compensation in public blessings, he should maintain the dignity of his character and station, much more than actors who represent the persons of kings and tyrants, who we see, when they either laugh or weep on the stage, follow not their own private inclinations, but the course consistent with the subject and with their position. And if, moreover, when our neighbor is in misfortune, it is not our duty to forbear offering any consolation, but rather to say whatever may tend to cheer him, and to invite his attention to any agreeable objects. Just as we tell people who are troubled with sore eyes to withdraw their sight from bright and offensive colors to green, and those of a softer mixture, from whence a man seek in his own case better arguments of consolation for afflictions in his family than from the prosperity of his country, by making public and domestic chances count, so to say together, and the better fortune of the state obscure and conceal the less happy circumstances of the individual. I have been induced to say so much because I have known many readers melted by Aeschylus's language into a soft and unmanly tenderness. But now, to turn to my narrative. The Greek cities were inspired once more by the efforts of Demosthenes to form a league together. The Thebans, whom he had provided with arms, set upon their garrison and slew many of them. The Athenians made preparations to join their forces with them. Demosthenes ruled supreme in the popular assembly, and wrote letters to the Persian officers who commanded under the king in Asia, inciting them to make war upon the Macedonian, calling him child and simpleton. But as soon as Alexander had settled matters in his own country and came in person with his army into Boeotia, down fell the courage of the Athenians, and Demosthenes was hushed. The Thebans deserted by them, fought by themselves, and lost their city. After which the people of Athens, all in distress and great perplexity, resolved to send ambassadors to Alexander, and amongst others made choice of Demosthenes for one, but his heart failing him for fear of the king's anger, he returned back from Kithaeron and left the embassy. In the meantime, Alexander sent to Athens, requiring 10 of the orators to be delivered up to him, as Idomeneus and Doris have reported. But as the most and best historians say, he demanded these 8 only: Demosthenes, Peleeuctus, Ephialtes, Lycurgus, Moerocles, Demon, Callisthenes, and Charidemus. It was upon this occasion that Demosthenes related to them the fable in which the sheep are said to deliver up their dogs to the wolves, himself and those who with him contended for the people's safety being in his comparison the dogs that defended the flock, and Alexander the Macedonian arch-wolf. He further told them, as we see corn masters, grain, sell their whole stock by a few grains of wheat, which they carry about with them in a dish as a sample of the rest. so you, by delivering up us, who are but a few, do at the same time, unawares, surrender up yourselves altogether with us. So we find it related in the history of Aristobulus, the Cassandrian, the Athenians were deliberating and at a loss what to do, when Demosthenes, having agreed with the persons whom Alexander had demanded for 5 talents, undertook to go ambassador and to intercede with the king for them, and whether it was that he relied on his friendship and kindness, or that he hoped to find him satiated as a lion glutted with slaughter, he certainly went, and prevailed with him both to pardon the men and to be reconciled to the city. So he and his friends, when Alexander went away, were great men, and Demosthenes was quite put aside. Yet when Agis the Spartan made his insurrection, he also for a short time attempted a movement in his favor, but he soon shrunk back again, as the Athenians would not take any part in it, and Agis being slain, the Lacedaemonians were vanquished. During this time it was that the indictment against Ctesiphon concerning the crown was brought to trial. The action was commenced a little before the battle in Calvranea, when Charondas was Archon, but it was not proceeded with till about 10 years after. Well, that's one way to get an innocent verdict, or guilty by, the back in the day, but Aristophanes being then Archon, never was any public cause more celebrated than this, alike for the fame of the orators, and for the generous courage of the judges, who, though at the time the accusers of Demosthenes were in the height of power and supported by all the favor of the Macedonians, yet would not give judgment against him, but acquitted him so honorably that Aeschines did not obtain the 5th part of their suffrages on his side, so that immediately after he left the city and spent the rest of his life in teaching rhetoric about the island of Rhodes and upon the continent in Ionia. It was not long after that Harpalus fled from Alexander and came to Athens out of Asia, knowing himself guilty of many misdeeds into which his love of luxury had led him, fearing the king, who was now grown terrible even to his best friends. Yet this man had no sooner addressed himself to the people and delivered up his goods and his ships and himself to their disposal, but the other orators of the town had their eyes quickly fixed upon his money, and came in to his assistance, persuading the Athenians to receive and protect their suppliant. Demosthenes at first gave advice to chase him out of the country, and to beware lest they involve their city in a war upon an unnecessary and unjust occasion. But some few days after, as they were taking an account of the treasure, Harpalus, perceiving how much he was pleased with the cup of Persian manufacture, and how curiously he surveyed the sculpture and fashion of it, desired him to poise it in his hand, and consider the weight of the gold. Demosthenes, being amazed to feel how heavy it was, asked him what weight it came to. To you, said Harpalus, smiling, it shall come with 20 talents. And presently after, when night drew on, he sent him the cup with so many talents. Harpalus, it seems, was a person of singular skill to discern a man's covetousness by the air of his countenance and the look and movements of his eyes. For Demosthenes could not resist the temptations, but admitting the present like an armed garrison into the citadel of his house, he surrendered himself up to the interest of Harpalus. The next day he came into the assembly with his neck swathed about with wool and rollers, and when they called on him to rise up and speak, he made signs as if he had lost his voice. But the wits, turning the matter to ridicule, said that certainly the orator had been seized that night with no other than a silver quincy, and soon after the people, becoming aware of the bribery, grew angry, and would not suffer him to speak or make any apology for himself, but ran him down with noise. And one man stood up and cried out, "What, ye men of Athens, will ye not hear the cupbearer?" So at length they banished Harpalus out of the city, and fearing lest they should be called to account for the treasure which the orators had purloined, they made a strict inquiry, going from house to house. Only Callicles, the son of Arrhenidas, who was newly married, they would not suffer to be searched, out of respects, as Theopompus writes, to the bride who was within. Demosthenes resisted the Inquisition and proposed a decree to refer the business to the court of Areopagus and to punish those whom the court condemned. When he came to the bar, he was fined 50 talents and committed to prison, whence, out of shame of the crime for which he was condemned, and through the weakness of his body, growing incapable of supporting the confinement, he made his escape, and by the carelessness of some and the contrivance of others of the citizens, we are told, at least, that he had not fled far from the city. Finding he was pursued by some of those who had been his adversaries, he endeavored to hide himself. Well, at least this guy's hiding rather than... But when they called him by his name, and coming up near to him, desired he would accept from them some money which they had brought from home as a provision for his journey, and to that purpose only had followed him, when they entreated him to take courage and to bear up against his misfortunes, he burst out into much greater lamentations, saying, "But how is it possible to support myself under so heavy an affliction, since I leave a city in which I have such enemies as in any other? It is not easy to find friends." He did not show much fortitude in his banishment.